Good morning again to everyone, and welcome back. I'm Owen Alterman from INSS, and we have a great concluding panel before the concluding remarks. And we should have plenty of time for questions and for discussion with our panel of two. First, I'll present Emily Landau, who for most people here needs no introduction. She is the head of our Arms Control and Regional Security Program here at INSS, also teaches at Tel Aviv University, the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya, and the University of Haifa, has been following the Iran negotiations doggedly for a decade, and so knows all of the ins and outs of how we got here. And I can also say, as a member of the team of the Arms Control Program, she is a terrific leader and mentor, and it's been fantastic working with her. And without further ado, Emily will talk about Netanyahu and the negotiations with Iran, looking at some of the statements by Prime Minister Netanyahu in the past few months and seeing what they mean or might mean for Israeli policy.
Thank you very much, Owen. What I want to do this morning is talk about something that I don't normally talk about. And this is Prime Minister Netanyahu's approach to the Iran negotiations. And I want to focus specifically on the question of the military threat as it finds expression in his rhetoric. So what I'm going to do is a kind of exercise in content analysis, mini content analysis, because I think a lot of assumptions are made about what Netanyahu's position is with regard to the negotiations, but I thought it would be interesting to take a closer look at what Netanyahu actually chooses to say. I'll begin by saying that as far as the overall controversy that surrounds Netanyahu's approach to the negotiations, I think it's a mistake to conclude that, or to imply, that there is no deal that Netanyahu would accept. I think that those that make this claim are making a political statement. And I think the intention of that political statement is to marginalize the quite valid criticism that Netanyahu has voiced with regard to the way the negotiations have been proceeding, as well as what we know about the emerging deal. But to say that Netanyahu does not want any deal is to imply that he would prefer the use of military force and war over a deal, because he obviously does not want Iran to acquire nuclear weapons. And I believe that overall this is not the case, and it's not supported by what Netanyahu says. There's no doubt that Israel has long been the target of quite horrific rejectionist rhetoric from Iranian leaders. And it's therefore been difficult for Israel to resist reacting to the threats that are directed at it. And since Netanyahu has become prime minister, Israel obviously has been much more vocal on this topic. Still, official statements hinting that if diplomacy fails, Israel may have to take military action in self-defense, I think over the years have often been misread as an eagerness to do so. And in fact, from 2003, and despite the so-called Begin Doctrine, whereby the best defense against nuclear capabilities in the region is forceful preemption, and this was mentioned yesterday by Uzi Arad, all of Israel's prime ministers since 2003 were on record with unequivocal support for diplomacy as the best means to rein in Iran. This, even though Israel has also attempted, especially but not only by Netanyahu, to add a measure of deterrence with its own threats of military force against Iran's nuclear facilities if diplomacy fails. And perhaps in 2012, in early 2012, there was actual intent to use military force, perhaps. But if so, we need to remember when that happened. It was when the disappointment with the negotiations track was at its height. It was just after the release of the incriminating IAEA report of November 2011, the one with the full annex of the possible military dimensions of Iran's nuclear program. And it was just before the biting sanctions of 2012 were put in place, which of course engendered the latest round of more serious negotiations. In fact, Israel's threat in early 2012 actually seems to have helped push the Europeans to go for the oil embargo. And that certainly helped the P5+1 gain leverage in the negotiations. But be that as it may, even though Israel has often been portrayed over the past year as not willing to accept any deal with Iran, as I said, this seems not supported by the evidence. In fact, it's hard to see where Israel would disagree with the U.S. that the best way to prevent Iran from attaining nuclear weapons is through a verified, negotiated deal. The catch, of course, is that it has to be a good deal. And there are certainly differences of opinion over the definition of a good and bad nuclear deal. The threats of military force as a last resort have received, I believe, a disproportionate amount of international attention. And looking at Netanyahu's statements and speeches, we find that this is not his major message, and certainly not over the past year. So what have we seen as far as Netanyahu's rhetoric over the course of 2014, 2015? Well, there's been a shift. There's been a shift in his rhetoric. And it manifests itself first in distancing himself from the specific Israeli security calculation towards a much greater emphasis on the global security concern. Second, he's moved away from the thinly veiled military threat to an approach that emphasizes first and foremost Israel's role in influencing the positions of the P5+1 negotiators. Now, while the element of self-reliance certainly remains a constant in Netanyahu's speeches, namely that at the end of the day, Israel can rely only on itself to ensure that its interests are upheld, there's been a subtle shift in how self-reliance is and should be expressed. If you will, self-reliance has become more about words and persuasion than about military might and armies. Netanyahu's high profile and very negative approach to the negotiations mean that these nuances have a tendency to get lost in the clamor. But I think taking a look at them and recognizing that they do in fact exist might provide some insight into what we can expect from Israel's government in the coming weeks and months. A note of caution: I'm at the preliminary stage, the initial stage of researching this topic, and I'm going to do it in a comprehensive manner together with Shimon Stein in a major analysis that we are undertaking. And if you've come to the conclusion that Shimon and I work a lot together, well, you're correct. So the insights that I'll be presenting here are preliminary, although I do believe that they are indicative. In addition, I'll be quoting from some of Netanyahu's speeches and statements. In other words, what he has chosen to say publicly, but we have not yet interviewed him or other Israeli officials on this topic. So let's take a look at the change in Netanyahu's rhetoric. The second extension of the negotiations over a comprehensive deal, which was announced November 24th, 2014, was a turning point as far as noting the change that had occurred in Netanyahu's rhetoric. In the months preceding the deadline, but certainly once it passed, Israeli officials have chosen not to dwell on the threat that a bad deal would pose to Israel in particular, and instead have highlighted the more general concerns tied to the outcome of a bad nuclear deal and to Iran's continued nuclear ambitions. And they emphasize the danger of Iran remaining at the nuclear threshold, the concern that is continuing to pursue research and development on more and more advanced generations of centrifuges, for example, fears of additional proliferation in the Middle East, fears with regard to Iran working on ICBM capabilities that can only mean that the regime has military nuclear intentions. A comparison of what Netanyahu said at the AIPAC policy conference in March 2014 and his address to the Saban Forum in early December 2014 reveals the change of emphasis from Israel's specific concern to the more global one. At the AIPAC policy conference, Netanyahu said, letting the worst terrorist regime on the planet get atomic bombs would endanger everyone, and it would certainly endanger Israel, since Iran openly calls for our destruction. 70 years ago, our people, the Jewish people, were left for dead. We came back to life. We will never be brought to the brink of extinction again. As Prime Minister of Israel, I will do whatever I must do to defend the Jewish state of Israel. At the Saban Forum, however, Netanyahu was focused on the avoidance of a bad deal and Israel's ability to have a positive influence in this regard from the sidelines. And what he said there was, the November 24 deadline has come and gone. That's fortunate, because a deal was not signed that would have left Iran as a threshold nuclear power. Though Israel isn't part of the P5+1, our voice and our concerns played a critical role in preventing a bad deal. In between these two addresses, Netanyahu's statements during an interview on BBC on the day that the extension was announced, November 24th, contain an element of self-reliance, but not in the sense that Israel reserves the right to take military action. Rather, Netanyahu was referring to verbal action, voicing Israel's concerns to the United States. And this, of course, is in line with his later Saban Forum statement about Israel's role in convincing the P5+1 to avoid a bad deal. What he said was, Israel will continue to defend itself using its own resources. We are following the nuclear talks with Iran closely and letting our views be known directly via my contacts with the American administration and other heads of government. The fact that Israel is less prone to putting its own threat perception at the forefront should not, of course, be read as a sign of complacency or trust that a good deal will be achieved. On the contrary, Israeli officials have strongly emphasized the dangers ahead, Iran's unwillingness to back away from its military ambitions, and the need to continue, of course, with the pressure of sanctions. The election dynamic in Israel in early 2015 and the lengthy process of forming a new government certainly created a distraction in the debate in Israel over negotiations with Iran. But Netanyahu, as you well know, did not disappear from the scene, and this was demonstrated most clearly by his highly controversial speech to Congress in early March. But in what many will no doubt perceive as a counterintuitive position for Netanyahu, especially in light of his confrontational approach towards the Obama administration on Iran, what Netanyahu was seeking more than anything was the ability to influence negotiations in order to get a better deal. Far from rejecting negotiations with Iran altogether, his evolving rhetoric reveals that what he actually wants most is to have an influence on those very negotiations. And this is the context, I think, for assessing Netanyahu's speech to Congress. In the speech, the only lines there that could be construed as hinting at a military threat came towards the end of his speech, after Netanyahu noted that Israel is strong and can defend itself. He went on to promise that even if Israel has to stand alone, Israel will stand. But in the continuation, Netanyahu filled standing alone with different meaning, virtually emptying it of any connotation of Israel taking unilateral military action and making it rather about U.S.-Israel solidarity. Because he said, but I know that Israel does not stand alone. I know that America stands with Israel. I know that you stand with Israel. My friends, may Israel and America always stand together, strong and resolute. So standing alone means standing up to the threat and not giving in to Iran, but in the sense that Israel will voice its concerns strongly, resolutely and controversially if necessary, but ultimately, Israel depends on the support of the United States. On Holocaust Remembrance Day, April 15th this year, a mere 2 weeks after the Lausanne outcome, Netanyahu devoted a considerable portion of his speech, obviously, to the Iranian threat. And although his disappointment with what was achieved in the talks was considerable, his solution remained decidedly non-military. His complaint was to the international community, who still refused to see how dangerous and unrelenting the Iranian regime is. He said, "We will continue to insist on the truth, and we will do everything we can to open the eyes that have closed. Moreover, even if we are compelled to stand alone, we will not be afraid. In any scenario, in any situation, we will safeguard our right, we will maintain our ability, we will keep our resolve to defend ourselves. 70 years ago, we were a people of war refugees, powerless and voiceless. Today, we express what we have to say, and we are determined to guarantee our existence and our future." He also added an interesting reference to Israel's regional neighbors, noting that perhaps the partnership Israel and its neighbors have in identifying threats will be the foundation for a partnership for forging a better, safer, and more peaceful future for the Middle East. I think it's revealing to compare these emphases with what Netanyahu chose to say about the Iranian nuclear threat on Holocaust Remembrance Day in 2012. At that time, he reminded people that 70 years ago, the Jewish people did not have the military might to defend itself. But today, things are different. Today, we have an army. We have the ability, the duty, and the determination to defend ourselves. I think by muting threats that hint at the possible use of military force, Netanyahu is today more accurately reflecting Israel's true role in the overall dynamic of confronting Iran and Israel's limited capability to have a real effect in that regard. Now, while a U.S. threat of military consequences for Iran's lack of seriousness at the negotiations would make perfect sense because the United States is leading the P5+1 in the negotiations with Iran, and a credible threat of force could definitely boost their leverage at the table, Israel, by contrast, is not at the table and has no formal role. And if we think about the post-deal situation, the chance that Israel would contemplate military force, I think, will diminish further, even though there are those that claim that in the face of a bad nuclear deal, Israel should reserve the right to employ military force. And in fact, this was interestingly mentioned in a document that was released by the Zionist camp after the elections. And what it said there was that if Iran does not uphold the agreement, Israel should have the right to act. But I would ask, what is the logic of Israel being the one to ensure that Iran upholds a deal that was negotiated by the P5+1? I think threatening a harsh response should be the responsibility of those that did negotiate the deal. What Israel is much more likely to be doing in the wake of a bad nuclear deal is asking the United States for additional military assistance and other guarantees in the face of a much, much more dangerous Iran. But the Israeli military option will probably recede even further to the background. But I'm sure this is among the issues that Yoav Eilen will discuss in his presentation. Thank you.